Welcome to another edition of the Pro Football Focus IDP podcast, The Nickel. I am once again your host, Walton Spurlin, and it is my pleasure, as always, to be joined by one of the best and brightest IDP fantasy minds out there, and that would be Mr. Ross Miles.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. As always, it's a pleasure to be working with you too, Wally. And not quite as upbeat as last week for me following the Rams' loss. Jarrad Goff throwing the interception on the first play of his potential game-tying drive in the fourth quarter. So that was a little bit annoying for me this week. I wasn't particularly fancying us to win, but I just wanted to see Goff actually have a chance to make a fourth quarter comeback drive and see how he handled the pressure. And it took one play and it was ball turned over. So otherwise, I'm excited to talk IDP fantasy football.
Yeah, and as a Lions fan, of course, I'm basking in the glory still of the Monday Night Football victory over the Giants. And boy, the Giants, that's a team that just doesn't look good. I mean, I'm glad the Lions won, but that offense is not getting it done. But we'll take it here. Yeah, go ahead.
My buddy popped over to see me before the show. He's a Giants fan, and he said that the Giants haven't scored over 20 points offensively in the last 8 games.
I think I heard that stat. That's just their offense looks so bland. I mean, I know Odell played last night, but he's nowhere near 100%. But hey, as a Lions fan, we'll take any victory you can get, especially with the Falcons coming to town next week. So I think the 2-game winning streak might end right about there. But let's get on to the IDP talk, which is why folks are listening to this podcast. So we're going to start out with kind of a weekly recap and some of the injury news out there. And let's start with a couple of stories that, well, one is kind of worked itself out, and that is that the Redskins have announced that strong safety Sewell Cravens is not going to play this season. There was kind of a back and forth, I think even before week 1. He's still thinking about retirement. Ross, what can we make of this situation? Is it just time to obviously it's time for this year to move on from Cravens? What else should we read into this?
Yeah, it's difficult to put sort of a nail in or a pin in exactly the right player to pick up to make the most of Cravens not being there. They looks like they're going to move forward with a bit of a combination of players already. So you want to keep an eye on DJ Swearinger, Monty Nicholson, and DeJour Everett. But for me, I think Swearinger is the most recognisable name. I think he's probably going to have the first proper crack at sort of any significant share of the duties. So Swearinger would be the one I would take out of all of them. But this is what his third or fourth NFL team, and he's not that many seasons into his career. Or at least it doesn't feel like it is to me. So he's clearly not an elite player. So he's going to struggle to make any real fantasy meat out of his opportunity, I'd imagine.
I agree with that. Maybe in a deep league where you have some bench space, you could stash him and see if it works out. But yeah, he's been up and down, and as you mentioned, moved from team to team. And there's generally a reason for that, for not sticking with a team. He finished strong for the Cardinals last year, and they went ahead and let him move on. So yeah, I think you nailed that situation. It's just some names to monitor, and the next situation is still very fluid, and we haven't gotten the whole story, and maybe we won't, but that's Lawrence Timmons leaving the Dolphins before their game this weekend, and head coach Adam Gose isn't sure at this point if he's going to remain with the team going forward. Now, like I said, this one's really in a state of flux right now, Ross.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the news is pretty light on the ground about what's exactly going on. The best I've heard so far is that Timmons was just absent without leave, and they filed a missing persons report or something along those lines. He was eventually found at the airport. He was I believe he was trying to fly back to somewhere where his son is. So he's got a young child. So maybe it definitely sounds like there's personal issues going on there. Again, as you say, we haven't really got clarity from the team about what the next steps are for them, if this is the end of the road for their relationship with Timmons. So yeah, it's definitely a monitor this situation. But I think we talked about Timmons' fantasy value in the past, and we just personally, I don't think he's going to be an impact player this season. Maybe an LB 3-4. So if you're holding on to him, this is probably enough for me to let him go and look for other options. And I think there are definitely a few out there.
Right. Yeah. What his role will be if he does return is up in the air. And this is a team hurting for linebackers with the rookie Raekwon McMillan being out for the season already. I guess the name to keep in mind, who they used in week 2, I want to say week 1 since it was their first game, but is Mike Hull. He played right inside linebacker, played 58 snaps, had double-digit tackles, 7 solos. So I guess if you want to grab him and stash him, maybe again, probably in a deeper league, there's probably better options, which we'll speak about as we move along here. But yeah, this situation, we still need to hear what's really going on, and we'll look forward to maybe hearing something in the next couple of days to clarify that a bit. Now let's talk about some injuries, and this first one really pains me because I know if you've listened to this podcast, I've been banging the Eric Reed drum pretty loudly, predicting he'd finish as a top 10 defensive back, and now it looks like he's expected to miss multiple weeks. What do we know about this situation, Ross?
Yeah, it's disappointing. I got on board late with Reed after listening to you. I actually had one draft left to go after our podcast a couple of weeks back before the season started, and I actually grabbed Reed as my backup safety. So hurting me as hopefully many of you other guys as well if you've been listening. But yeah, Kyle Shanahan said he's definitely out till week 3 against the Rams, potentially even longer. The Jaquiski Tart, someone I've plugged for it in the past, is going to take over as the starter. I think we've seen enough out of him to know he isn't quite going to transcend up to DB1 status, but he can post DB2 numbers when he's on the field. He does like to sort of dip his shoulder and get after the ball carrier, but again, he's another player dealing with an injury. He's got a neck problem at the minute, so his status for next week isn't clear either, but he's the guy I definitely take note of the most.
Yeah, that's a situation worth keeping an eye on to make sure. Like I said, I think if you have Reed, Tart is a good pickup. And like you said, he's one of those safeties that enjoys the tackling part of the game. So if he's on the field, he's going to be around the ball, but you're going to want to monitor his health throughout the week. So keep an eye on midweek practice reports or how much he's practicing for the 49ers. And a little bit better news is that the Browns are hopeful that Myles Garrett, dealing with an ankle issue, that maybe he'll return to practice this week. They haven't ruled him out, but what would you do with Garrett this week, Ross?
Yeah, in redraft leagues, I wouldn't be starting him in week 3. Obviously, you can wait until the last moment on Sunday to get your injury update before you plug in him and play him, but I think realistically what we're looking here is at week 4 at the earliest, which, that would ring true with anyone that knows anything about high ankle sprains. The initial prognosis before they started going all dark on us and trying to keep us away from what was actually going on was high ankle sprain, 3 to 4 weeks. So that makes sense, week 4 comeback. So pencil him in for week 4, but again, this is a guy we had on the fringe of being a DL2, maybe a top end DL3. So coming straight off injury, you might want to not even start him when he makes his debut. You might want to use one of your other players instead.
Yeah, keep an eye on how he looks out of the gate. It'll be his first NFL action, and again, coming off an ankle injury. You all know that affected my man Ziggy Ansah last year. It kind of stuck with him the whole year. So yeah, I believe that's sound advice too. Even once he'll probably be on a snap count as well. So even once he's announced that he's going to play, I'd still stash him on the bench and wait to see what he looks like. Another defensive end who's getting a little better news from his injury is Stephon Tuitt. The biceps injury that he suffered kept the Steelers defensive lineman out last week, but they're hopeful that maybe he'll be able to get back on the field this week.
I think there's potentially he could. I'm not overly impressed with what I've seen from the Bears so far, so on that basis, I think that they could potentially, still keep him out if they want to, or very, use him very sparingly, just as more of a kind of a blow the cobwebs out. But yeah, Tuitt for me, he's a top end DL3 really. He can have DL2 days. But I wouldn't be getting overly excited about his return. He's definitely more of a depth player that offers consistent scoring. He's not a boom or bust scorer. He's not a sack artist. So if he's sitting on the waivers, you might want to consider picking him up in preparation for having a really solid bye week replacement. But he's not someone I'm going to be clamoring over.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And the Steelers, like you said, the matchup, they probably won't need him against the Bears. And no offense, Bears fans, but your team hasn't looked very good. So it might be wise to err on the side of caution for the Steelers here. Maybe give him one more week to get really game ready. And speaking of game ready, middle linebacker B.J. Goodson was not ready for last night's game against my Lions, and this injury kind of cropped up late. I believe the first time he hit the injury report was Saturday, and he ended up missing the game, and I think that was very good news for my Lions, and I think it helped out. Eric Ebron was able to exploit his replacement. So what's the latest we hear on B.J. Goodson?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, he should be back next week, but I haven't seen anything particularly confirmed. Obviously, the practice reports will start coming out next couple of days. The biggest takeaway for me is that this might actually help people who didn't manage to get Goodson in the first round of the waivers. And unless you're pretty into your IDP, you might miss why Goodson suddenly went from having a huge day to getting nothing. So he might get dropped again. So keep an eye on what's going on with Goodson owners. You might be able to even, if they pick them up off the waivers and then he's got a zero, try and tempt him with a cheeky trade offer maybe. If you like Goodson, I've got no problems with him coming back this season and being fantasy relevant all year.
Yeah, and they mentioned that this was an injury that he'd been dealing with. So this was just a chance for the Giants to say, what, let's give you a week to recover. I believe it's a shin injury or a lower leg injury anyway, and just let's give you this week off so that we'll have you back at full strength for week 3. But it's getting late early for the Giants now that they've fallen to 0-2. So I could see getting him back in the lineup would be beneficial. So hopefully he gets back out there for not only IDP purposes but for the Giants. And we got another it's a hamstring injury here for Vic Beasley. I think a slight hamstring tear, and so that's definitely going to affect the Falcons' pass rush. And what can folks do to try to navigate while Beasley's out?
Oh, it's a painful one. I'm a big Beasley fan. I definitely like the guy. He obviously sometimes is difficult to get it in your team for fantasy value because he plays as a linebacker, obviously a hybrid defensive end linebacker. Depends what league system you're in, your host site. But if you're looking for a replacement, I think the obvious place to look within the same squad would be Takaris McKinley, the rookie. He's looked okay so far. He hasn't exactly exploded out of the gates, but he is someone who I think represents plenty of upside with his sack chances. So if he's going to have a month or so, I'd imagine with Beasley out to put a marker down and try and gain some game time when Beasley returns.
Yeah, and McKinley, you can see that he was the person they sort of turned to when Beasley was out, because he only played, I believe, 14 snaps in week 1, and then that jumped up to 44 snaps in week 2. And while he didn't really chart any numbers of note, he did have 2 QB hits and 2 QB hurries, and that can quickly turn into sacks. So, I believe you hit on the right name there, and I believe that's who the Falcons will turn to. And I'm just going to run down a quick few injuries that I jotted down from my notes. Kwon Alexander left week 2 with a hamstring injury and didn't return. I haven't been able to find out. There's no real practice reports coming out yet as we record this on Tuesdays. So that's something to monitor in Tampa Bay. Obviously, he's a big name linebacker. We don't want to see him miss a lot of time. Jarrad Davis, the Lions rookie linebacker, he suffered a concussion in last night's game against the Giants. On a short week, it's highly unlikely that he'll be able to get through the protocol. So keep that in mind if you've been riding Jarrad Davis. Jamie Collins of the Browns also suffered a concussion, so he'll have to work through the protocol. And one last quick note, just because we've touched on the Bears and how things aren't going well for them. Well, Nick Kwiatkowski, who took over for Jarrell Freeman at linebacker once Freeman was out for the year, it looks like he may be out for the year with the same injury, a pectoral injury. So he was having a strong first quarter, 4 solo tackles. I think the next man up might be Christian Jones, who's never really amounted to much. But those are a few more injuries of note. TJ Watt also left the game with a groin injury, but they say there's hope that he might be able to play this week. So I think that kind of gets us caught up on the injuries, and now let's talk about some performances, and we'll start with the defensive line. And the first thing I just wanted to throw out, we have some notes here. I'm going off script, Ross, but for your team, good news for your Rams. Aaron Donald returned.
He did, yeah, perfect to get him on the field. He didn't have a huge fantasy day, but he did enough to sort of be a bit mischievous and sort of cause trouble up the middle. I thought he was going to get credited with a sack in the first quarter or maybe early second, but it didn't show up on the stat sheet, so I'm not sure why. For me, he was the guy that did all the work and got to the guy first. Maybe they credited the guy that put the final arm on him.
Oh, we hate when that happens, but I think what's very encouraging is that he played 48 snaps. I made a note of that, so that was a pretty good amount for his first action of the season. So things looking up for Aaron Donald and Aaron Donald owners and Ross. And now, speaking of looking up, you have to look up long and hard to find a defensive lineman that had a better game than the Chiefs' Chris Jones. Boy, 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and an interception. So, Ross, how excited should we be excited about this? And what are the chances that he can continue to build on that?
Well, we should be excited for the big man. He's had such a great game. Don't forget, he had 4 total tackles as well. And the reason I'm going to point that out is because I doubt he's ever going to have a 3 turnover game ever again in his career. No offense to the guy. For me, he's fringe value in DT required leagues only. I wouldn't be considering him in leagues where you can mix in your defensive ends. He's a decent player. He's obviously anyone who plays in the NFL is much more than a decent player. But for me, his fantasy value it isn't going to be sustainable. He's not of a turnover artist really.
Right, but boy, that is a game right there. If you happen to be somebody that started him, like in a defensive tackle required league, then I think you were laughing all the way to a win there. But yeah, we can't let a game like that go by without mentioning it. And another big game from someone, and of course I get to bask a little again for my Lions. Ziggy Ansah comes out, gets 3 sacks in last night's game, which he eclipses the 2 total he had all of last year. So that's a very good sign for Ziggy, and it's even more impressive because, let the people know, Ross, why is it even a little bit more impressive than just looking and seeing 3 sacks?
Yeah, so what really struck me when I sort of delved into Ziggy Ansah's big day was he was only on the field for half the snaps on Monday Night Football, and he only played 45% of snaps, in week 1. So he really is on a limited game script right now. So the fact he's having such great performances while doing such is certainly a huge bonus for his fantasy owners and bodes well for later in the season.
Right, and he also was credited with 6 solo tackles. And your show notes got me interested. I looked. He only played 28 snaps last night, so that's making the most of the opportunities. And another player making the most of his opportunities is for the Dallas Cowboys. That's DeMarcus Lawrence. He has come firing out of the starting gate to begin the 2017 season. Ross, talk a little bit about what Lawrence is doing and what maybe we can expect.
Yeah, so we praised him last week and said, if he's on the waiver wire, this is someone to go and get. We think he might be a double-digit sack player this season, and by golly, he certainly is most of the way there already. He 7 total tackles and 2 sacks in their 42-17 loss to the Broncos. So yeah, 2 games into this season, he's already halfway to his previous career high of 8 sacks. So yeah, this is huge news for anyone who's on the Lawrence train, and I think it's going to be all aboard.
Yeah, he's definitely finally really starting to play to the potential that's been there. And again, he's had a back issue. I believe he's dealt with suspensions. So if he can stay healthy and out of trouble, Yeah, he's on his way to a really really nice season. So yeah,
Interestingly, it's a contract season. I wonder if that's a motivator at all.
you know, it wouldn't be the first time. And as you said, if people didn't listen last week and he's still out there on that waiver wire, make him a high priority. And now we have a few other defensemen that defensemen. I got hockey on my mind. I'm sorry there. Defensive linemen that had big weeks, and some of these guys we touched on. But Jerry Hughes, Buffalo Bills, he's back at defensive end, folks, and he racked up 2 sacks last week.
He did, and another guy to join him in that crew was another old gun, Julius Peppers, 37 years old, and he managed to rack up 2 sacks last week. He also had 6 total tackles, but for me, Peppers is definitely more of a spot start if he gets a good matchup. I wouldn't be counting on it every week.
Right? Yeah. Who says he can't go home again? Right? He goes back to the Panthers, and it's the fountain of youth. But as you said, that I don't think we can expect that to be the norm. Maybe as a bye week filler, you'll get you plug him in, you'll get lucky as another game like that. But I don't think you can really count on it. And one thing we can count on through 2 weeks is defensive tackle Geno Atkins of the Bengals he's playing some pretty good football, and he had 2 more sacks in week 2.
He did. He did. It was. Yeah. I'm not sure if I mentioned in our recent podcast, but I got a buddy into football recently, and I've told him to support the Texans. He wanted a defensive football team that's not a winner, that's an up and coming team. And I said, well, I think that the Texans are a fun team to support right now with J.J. Watt, a brand new quarterback, and he watched the game on Thursday night and made a comment. He was like, "There's a big guy for the Bengals doing some hitting." And he looked him up and he goes, "Yeah, that Geno Atkins fella, he is a monster." And I was like, "Yes, my friend is starting to recognise Geno Atkins is a monster." It was an astute observation from a new fan.
Hey, and when a newbie, as we call them sometimes, sees a player that stands out like that tells you that he's playing well, and that's actually 3 sacks on the season for Atkins already. So again, another, obviously a high. Well, probably was a pretty high pick just because there's not that many defensive tackles in defensive tackle acquired leagues that would do that. And we had another. I guess he's a veteran now. I've been playing this game so long. I remember when he was just a rookie. But Everson Griffin, playing opposite Daniel Hunter, he managed to put up 2 sacks for the Vikings last week.
Yeah, I think Griffin is someone who we previously had as a top 5 defensive lineman, and maybe hasn't quite lived up to that hype. But I still think he's a top 10 guy. He's got another top 10 guy, I believe, across from him. And when you've got a duo of pass rushers like Griffin and Hunter, they're going to be productive. They're going to be hard to stop.
Yeah, and that team, the Vikings, with Sam Bradford dealing with a knee issue, is going to have to lean hard on that defense. So yeah, Griffin and Hunter, 2 of the best bookends at getting after the quarterback. So again, Griffin's a guy that you're generally going to start on a weekly basis, even though I believe we both have kind of, pimped Hunter a little bit more than him heading into this year. But I think, both are worth starting. And now, Ross, go ahead and let the people know who some possible waiver wire defensive linemen could be.
Yeah, so we've obviously been scouting around as well, trying to keep an eye on the people who are playing well and could be available in multiple leagues. And I think we've talked about how well Jerry Hughes is playing. So how about his teammate, Shaq Lawson? He had a sack last week, had 5 total tackles. I don't believe he's really going to push on to quite be a DL2, possibly in the right matchups. But interestingly for me, he's playing a little bit in the rotation, which is keeping him fresh. He's only played just under 65% in the first 2 games, so I think that could bode well for him, and I think he's someone worth paying attention to. Another guy I'm quite keen on is Noah Spence. Now, I was thinking of potentially would have to list him last week, but the abandoned game cost him his week 1 game. So yeah, a sack and a forced fumble last week. Only 2 total tackles, but he is going to be a boom and bust scorer. He is going to be someone who pushes, I think, double-digit tackles, but maybe only posts 25 total tackles in the season. So yeah, I think Noah Spence is a guy to definitely chase after as well.
It was nice to see him come out with that his first game because he was getting a lot of preseason hype from teammates and the beat writers down there. So he sort of lived up to it. Like I said, low tackles right now, but Again, we'll see how his snap count. That's not a bad snap count to start with, and we'll see if that builds coming off of that performance. But yeah, definitely a name, and he could be out there on the waiver wire. So make sure you got him again high on your priorities. And now let's look to the linebacker position, and it was kind of a meh kind of week for linebackers as far as there was no B.J. Goodson week one 14 solos, 18 total tackles, just not a lot of big plays.
Yeah, it's a weird one. When I was putting together the notes, I was sort of looking through, trying to sort of identify the top performers, and it just seemed a lot of like good performances rather than, I didn't really want to bang the drum and say like this guy had an outstanding, like we did for Goodson, like you said last week. But this week, for me, one of the best players was probably Talvin Smith. 8 total tackles, 1 for a loss, added an interception, scored plenty of fantasy points, showing he can still be productive with a different partner alongside him. I'm saying that Pelosny saw a bit more of the field this week, but yeah, I mean, didn't really see any outstanding linebacker performances.
Yeah, just a lot of names that you would expect to have the good weeks, who maybe didn't in week one, and I believe we touched on this where he didn't. It's you have to be patient with your stud linebackers. The matchups, the flow of the game sometimes can really affect their stat totals. So don't just look at the stat totals and think that he had a bad game. And somebody like that was Alec Ogletree of your Rams there. Finally, this is a more competitive game, and he ended up with double-digit tackles, 10 total tackles, a sack, and a tackle for loss. That's what we can kind of come to expect from him. And people that were getting panicky and thinking maybe they needed Goodson for Ogletree or something on those lines. Take it easy. So the big names bounced back. Navarro Bowman, right? I'm just looking at the notes here. Yeah, Zach Brown, Mark Barron, they all had double-digit total tackles. But again, they were missing the big plays.
Yeah, I mean, one of the players that jumped out at me this week was Ramon Humber. He also had 10 plus total tackles. He had 11 this week, 12 last week. He's playing over 95% of the snaps. He's a guy that, you look over his career, you're just thinking journeyman, like a really good special teamer. But he's fallen into a sweet little spot in Buffalo, and he's starting to rack up some points on the weak side now. I'm definitely marking him down as a pickup on the waiver wire. I don't know if he's my top linebacker, but you'd run it close. He's definitely somebody you going to get hold of.
Yeah, and it's sort of surprising because, as you said, he's a veteran, and it's like he just maybe never got the opportunity, and now that he's getting it, he's putting up nice numbers for us. I think he's definitely worth a pickup. Just like you said, double digit tackles 2 weeks in a row, right? So,
yeah, exactly. I mean,
go ahead.
My thoughts on why you want to pick him up would just purely be, I do think he's a little bit of a shot in the dark, and I'm not pushing him straight up into my sort of fantasy relevant every single week. But if it's sustainable, you've just added like a really, really good bye week replacement or alternate starter. If it doesn't, you haven't really lost too much. You just picked a guy up off the waivers. He didn't quite pan out. You let him go. So don't go overly aggressive for him. But if you can nab him, he could be a wily little pick come the second half of the season.
Yeah. And speaking of wily, a wily old veteran, Carlos Dansby. He gets 10 total tackles last week for the Cardinals, and I believe it's his third time playing for the Cardinals. Carlos has been a little well-traveled, but you have it right down here in the show notes. And every season that he's played 16 games, he gets over 100 total tackles, and we kind of like that from our linebackers.
Yes, we do. He's on the field a lot. He's played over 95% of the snaps. And I did, I looked through his career stats, and even when he hasn't played, when he's played 14, 15 games, he's normally on like 90 plus tackles. So he is exceptionally consistent, really is, career average of 6.7 tackles a game. If he's out there on the waiver wire, again, he's probably he's a similar player to Humber, really. I think the fact that Humber's performing at such a high level on the weak side at the minute, I would maybe have Humber slightly above Dansby, but there's a lot more risk in the Humber pick. With Dansby, I feel really confident he's going to nail his 6.7 total tackles a game. With Humber, we're not quite sure where it's going to end up. So if you want a safer pick for a bench player, Dansby's your way to go. If you're willing to roll the dice, I think Humber's the man.
Yeah, it depends if you feel like a gamble. But yeah, as you said it, that's just Carlos is just steady Eddie production, and again, you like to have that, and especially if you have it on the bench. I think a situation to monitor will be is once Dion Buchanan returns, but it looked like he had a setback with his injury, so I don't even know if there's a real timetable for that. So in the meantime, yeah, getting Dansby off the waiver wire is a good idea, and there's a young linebacker in Dallas who I believe has worked himself into waiver wire consideration.
Yeah, Jalen Smith. He actually led the team in total tackles in week two, which is actually pretty notable, bearing in mind he plays alongside Sean Lee. Only played 61 snaps in the first week, but he played 88% of snaps this week. So, taking those two things into consideration, I think Jalen Smith is a nice add in deeper setups.
Oh, exactly, and coming back from that awful knee injury that he suffered, and where there was potential nerve damage, or I believe there was some nerve damage and everything. It's kind of another one of those little feel good stories that we like, along with the IDP production and some other guys that had good weeks. Lavonte David, 9 total tackles and a fumble recovery. So perhaps the reports of his demise are greatly exaggerated. We'll have to see. Again, Kwon was out for I think the majority of that game. Kwon Alexander with the hamstring, but that's a nice bounce back first game of the season for David. And Chandler Jones out in the playing for the Cardinals, who we were just talking about with Dansby. He had a pretty nice week.
He did, which is painful. 7 total tackles and 2 sacks. Imagine if he was doing that from defensive end.
Ugh.
I think the point is made.
Yeah, those designations. Yeah, that was a tough one when he went from New England to Arizona and immediately became an outside linebacker. I guess we could move on and let's see. Yeah, we got about 14 minutes or so to talk about maybe some defensive backs.
That sounds like a plan. That definitely sounds like a plan. I think the guy I'm going to kick off with then is a Jordan Poyer. He had 11 total tackles and a sack this week, which, he's taken over the starting free safety role for the Bills, which again is, maybe slightly surprising that he's the one that's assumed that position. But what surprised me slightly more was the production level this last week, in the sense that he only had 3 total tackles in the first week, and he's up that to 11. He had some splash plays in week 1, but yeah, I think he's a guy we want to keep an eye on. He was probably the top defensive back fantasy-wise last week. I don't think that's probably going to happen again this season, but he is someone that has put his name into fantasy relevance now.
Right. Anytime you get to see the double-digit total tackles and a sack, that's a good week. And was that, I believe that's is that his second sack on the season?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's definitely worth a grab and stash if you've got the room. Maybe even a spot start. It's sometimes riding the hot hand's not a bad way to go, and the hot hand can turn into a whole season. And a guy that had a nice game is a name that the IDP veteran owners know, or veteran player, Desmond Trufant. Talk a little bit about the week that he had.
Yeah, you can't go wrong when you get a defensive touchdown. That normally equals a pretty good day for any defensive back or any IDP from a full stop. So he did so via a fumble recovery, which I think was actually a backward pass. So he also snagged an interception. So pretty decent numbers. But for me, the key takeaway for Desmond Trufant is the fact he's only had 6 total tackles through 2 games. So we kind of mentioned it last week. You do need to be a little bit wary about who you're trying to pick up on when it comes to your defensive backs. How reliant are they on turnovers or splash plays for their points tally? If their points tally is like 50% or more to do with splash plays, I'm probably going to rule them off my list. Well, defensive backs at least. Different for defensive ends, obviously, but yeah, you want to be careful. For me, tackle producers are the way you want to go, and that's someone who's a bit more like Kareem Jackson.
I was just about to say, yeah. Last in week 2, he not only had the slash plays, but yeah, the 7 total tackles, and added a sack and a forced fumble. And we love those points, and especially from cornerbacks. So obviously in a cornerback required league, he's somebody you want. He also had 6 total tackles, I believe, in the opener. So he's obviously being tested. So he's getting the tackle opportunities, and then when you can throw in the big plays. This is a guy who's definitely worth a claim in cornerback required leagues. And again, I always mention roster depth, but I'm about grabbing as many guys as I can. And again, especially at the defensive back position, where we've kind of spoken in depth about it. It's you know just a 1 week replacement's fine. Just be ready to let him go. Just don't grow attached to him. Just bring him in for that 1 week you need him, and go ahead and let him go after that. And somebody like Jamar Taylor. Talk a little bit about the week that he's had and the season so far.
Yeah, so he had 9 tackles this week, 6 tackles last week. Again, this is the kind of player you want to be focusing in on. He's a defensive back that can be trusted to put up consistent tackle numbers, mainly because he does things like allow 11 of 12 passes in his coverage to be completed. If you can't break up passes or stop completions, they're going to keep throwing at you. And whether it's a pass defense or a tackle when the pass is being completed, it's still the same for you as a fantasy owner. So definitely something to keep an eye on.
Oh, exactly. And as you mentioned, if you're not covering that well, or they can complete the passes in your direction, then hey, as IDP owners, we love it, because there's your tackle opportunity. And somebody who's getting plenty of those is Justin Bethel for the Cardinals, and probably a lot due to the reason we were just touching on.
Yeah, again, he's seen 15 targets so far this season, which is seventh highest among defensive backs. One of the reasons why he's allowed 2 touchdowns. So if you're going to let touchdowns in, people are going to keep throwing at you. Teams around the league know who is responsible for touchdowns. They look at his, game film as part of what they do. And if someone like Bethel is proving to be a liability in coverage, he will continue to see targets. Yeah, add on the fact he's actually turned one of those into a pick six. He has actually got an interception. He's returned a touchdown himself. But obviously, being beaten for 2 touchdowns, people are going to take risks and throw it up against you.
Oh, exactly. And he had that pick six against my Detroit Lions in the opener, and then of course went on to get burned by the Galladay on the long touchdown, and pretty much burned the rest of the game. That's kind of the Bethel way. And we have a couple more waiver wire possibility defensive backs to talk about. But first, Ross, I wanted to touch on something that we mentioned last week, and that was the snap count for Von Bell of the Saints. And that whole secondary is in a bit of disarray. Now, I believe he had, what was it, like 3 or 8 or something in week 1. It was we couldn't figure out why he didn't play. Well, that increased to 32 snaps in week 2, and now I read a report where Kenny Vaccaro was benched late in that game. Obviously New England was moving the ball pretty well, and there were reports earlier in the week that the Saints are shopping Vaccaro, and now he's been benched. So maybe that helps Bell moving forward. I know that he was kind of going to be the heir apparent. Well, maybe that's a situation worth monitoring, Ross?
Quite possibly, yeah. I mean, I'm having a quick look at the some of the data behind the scenes on the game now, and not only did Vaccaro only see 49 out of a possible 76 snaps, so he did come off the field. Very much looks like a benching. Obviously, that doesn't get noted down here. I'm just looking at the raw numbers, but yeah, his performance was graded negatively or poorly. So on that basis, for me anyway, Vaccaro is a player who has never really lived up to the hype. He was very, very highly touted when he came out as a rookie for both his actual skill set and his fantasy potential. And I don't think he's really delivered on either count. They've definitely given him plenty of time. This is going to be his 3rd, maybe 4th season in the league. I would definitely wouldn't say he's panned out in the way that New Orleans was hoping. So I could definitely understand if they were trying to see if there's any suitors for him out there.
Right. I'm not certain that benching him is the way to go. That's not exactly showing his stuff, but yeah, I agree with you completely. He's sort of been an IDP underachiever, and apparently now for the Saints, he's become an NFL underachiever. So once again, the only real safety that's playing steady and consistent snaps is Marcus Williams, and because once again he played 75 snaps last week. That didn't really turn into much. He ended up with 3 solos and 5 total tackles. But I just wanted to touch on that situation real quick, because I know we had mentioned Bell and said we would look into it, and so it looks like it still needs some looking into. But
Yeah,
A
and a
little.
bit more on Vaccaro for you. So week one, he allowed 5 of 5 for 82 yards and 2 touchdowns. So that was definitely a flag that he's not been performing. He tightened up a little bit last week against the Patriots. He only allowed 3 of 5 and didn't concede a touchdown. But obviously, he did enough to get himself pulled from the field before he could do any further damage. So
Right. So yeah, a fluid situation in the Saints secondary, and they're going to need to get that worked out. So I believe they've fallen to 0-2 now. So it's getting late fast for the Saints as well. And let's go back to the waiver wires and waiver wire possibilities for defensive backs. And one of them was on display last night, and that's Eli Apple.
yeah, it's another player who the reason I think he's worth looking at is targets. Pure and simple. He ranks fifth in targets, one more than Justin Bethel at 16. He's allowed 12 of those 16 passes into his coverage to be caught, and he's also given up 2 TDs. So this is a guy who's failing to stop completions and giving up touchdowns. The result so far is he's got 12 total tackles, and if he's going to keep up those kind of performances, he could well be seeing 60, 70 tackles this season. And obviously he will get his hand on a few of them, and he probably will make an interception, but he's going to continue to see targets with this kind of performance.
Exactly, and of course the Giants were without the services of Janoris Jenkins last night. Although I believe I also read that's kind of the same situation as B.J. Goodson, and they expect him to be ready for week 3. And I think what we can expect, because of the numbers you just touched on, is that quarterbacks are going to keep finding Eli Apple on the field, and they will definitely be throwing into his coverage or lack thereof. And we have another name that is someone you want to keep an eye on your waiver wire. That's LaMarcus Joyner. Talk a little bit about what he's doing so far.
Yeah, Joyner's an interesting one. He's a pretty speedy defensive back. He showed some good foot speed in his race to bring down a touchdown scorer for the Redskins this week. He closed the distance. He closed a large distance, but couldn't quite get to him in time. He made 9 total tackles this week. He allowed 3 catches out of 3 for 54 yards, but probably more alarmingly was that 46 of those yards were after the catch. So that missed tackles, that kind of thing. So I'm a bit torn on Joyner. He's very aggressive when he's on the field. Like, he wants to make plays, and he's, like I said, he's speedy. He gets after things. He doesn't give up. But I think some of that aggression translates into mistakes, and mistakes translates into getting punished, and that means constant targets. So I think he's more of a matchup play. I think you want to pick him when you think he can be targeted often, and when that's going to happen, I think he's probably a DB too.
No, and then you like to see those numbers from defensive backs, and like you said, it's kind of we like the aggressive plug and play strategy. Again, defensive backs. I know I sound like a broken record when I talk about them, but to me, you can't really go wrong adding and dropping even on a weekly basis. As long as I'm obviously not talking about the studs like a Landon Collins or Keanu Neal or Rashad Jones, guys like that. But yeah, guys like Joyner, can catch on fire for a week, lead your team to victory. And if the matchup in the following week is not a positive one for defensive backs, or it doesn't look appealing, you throw them back on the pile and move on. No regrets. That's sort of the way to look at things. And one quick last situation I meant to talk about it in news and notes just real quick is that the news: Brian Cushing, linebacker, suspended 10 games. He was already dealing with a concussion. Just was going to touch on perhaps maybe a name to watch. There was rookie Zach Cunningham out of, I believe, from Vanderbilt. He ended up playing 43 snaps against the Bengals in that Thursday night game. Stat line, 4 solos, 6 totals. But still, sometimes it's good to get out in front of situations and maybe grab a guy, again, stash him. But he seems to be the name there.
Yep, I think that it's a wise pickup. Cunningham was someone that did
garner a little bit of attention during the draft process. Some people were quite high on his potential. I don't see why that wouldn't be a problem to pick him up and slap him on your bench for the time being until we see him produce some bigger numbers.
Right, and that kind of happened quickly, and he was someone to keep an eye on. I was keeping an eye on in the preseason. He played a lot of snaps in the preseason, so kind of knew he wasn't going to be hitting the field early. But Cushing's been on the downside of his career for a while, and this I believe is his second. That's why it's 10 games suspension, I believe, for PEDs, and so the future could be sooner rather than later for Cunningham. And as you mentioned, when that happens, it's a good idea to grab a guy, too early before it's too late. And speaking of too late, with that, we have once again reached the end of another week of tintillating IDP talk.
It sounds like we have, Ollie. It's been a pleasure as always, and I look forward to returning to chatting with you next week. So to our listeners, adios amigos.